Halloween night was always a thrill. My friends and I had spent weeks planning our costumes, mapping out our trick-or-treat route through town. I'd gone as a pirate, with an eye patch and a plastic sword hanging from my side, while my friends each had costumes that suited them perfectly, Emma as a witch, Jack as a vampire, and Liz as a zombie bride. We'd already hit half the neighborhood, laughing as we darted from house to house, our pillowcases filling up with candy. The night was perfect, crisp air, bright orange pumpkins glowing on every porch, and even the occasional howl of some far-off neighborhood dog added to the festive eeriness. Everything was going just right, just the usual Halloween fun, until someone brought up the old house on the edge of town. "Hey, what about the house near the cemetery?" said Jack mischievously with a grin, his fangs glinting in the streetlight. Liz raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that place abandoned?" "I heard it's haunted," Emma added with a spooky whisper. A shiver of excitement ran through me. We had known about the house by the cemetery. It had been the subject of ghost stories since any of us could remember. It had been an old, shadowy place set back from the road and had always seemed slightly out of place, like it didn't quite belong in our town. It was said to be fearsome enough to scare off anyone who dared knock on the door. We looked at one another, a mix of excitement and nervousness written across both our faces. Halloween was the one night when we could get away with exploring something unknown, something a little spookier than the normal decorations and costumes. "All right," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Let's do it. Let's go to the house by the cemetery." We went down the avenue, facing away from all the houses with porch lights that seemed to shine like warm reflections. As we walked further, the darkness as well as the quietness enveloped us more and more. The sound of laughs and good chatter started fading out, replaced by the rustling sound of fallen leaves under our feet. As we neared the edge of town, the shadows grew deeper and heavier. A chill ran down my spine that wasn't quite related to cold. We could see the cemetery looming to our right, its grave markers casting long shadows on the ground. Then we saw it, the house, a dark sentinel standing watch at the edge of the cemetery. It was older than I remembered, the paint peeling, the windows dark and dusty. The trees surrounding it had no leaves, their gnarled branches outstretched like skeletal hands. My heart pounded in my chest as we came to a stop in front of the rickety gate, each of us silent, feeling the weight of the decision. Jack laughed then, nervously, a break in the silence. "Well, are we doing this, or what?" I reached for the gate, breathing deeply as my hand started to shake. The gate creaked noisily as I pushed it, its sound carrying well into the night. We walked up the cracked stone path, each step feeling heavier than the last. The porch was littered with dried leaves, and a single, dim lantern swayed gently by the door. My hand hesitated, a weird sense of dread settling over me, as I reached out to knock. But I couldn't chicken out now, not with everyone watching. So, with one last glance at my friends, I raised my fist and knocked 3 times, each knock echoing louder than I'd expected. No one said a word for a time. I thought maybe the house was abandoned, or at least no one was home. But just about the time that I was going to suggest we leave, out came the creak of the door, showing me a tall man standing in the shadows of the doorway. He looked so very ordinary. Clad in a plain black coat, his hair slicked back, he held a bowl of candy in his hands, though his face was lined, like someone who'd seen a lot of years. The smile was warm and inviting. "Happy Halloween," he greeted. His voice was soft and kind. "I don't get many visitors out here. Please, come in. I have treats inside for you all." We exchanged uneasy glances, but something in his tone of voice sounded almost reassuring. He sounded almost sincere, almost nice. Stories about this place might be just that, stories. Some Halloween myth to keep children near and far from here. "Thank you," I said, took a step forward, trying to ignore this nagging feeling that was wrong. We entered into the house one by one, wrapping ourselves in the warmth within. The man smiled and shut the door softly behind us. The moment I stepped inside, there suddenly was the feeling of warmth surrounding me. The house had its lights low, but there was an eerie coziness inside it, the feeling one gets stepping inside the room that had been lived in for generations. The walls were covered with dark, old-fashioned wallpaper, and there were shelves filled with peculiar knickknacks, brass timepieces, porcelain dolls, and dusty books. Small pumpkins carved with faces flickered in the soft glow of candles that were placed inside of them, resting on different surfaces. Each one had a strangely lifelike expression, as if they were observing us. He set the candy bowl on a little table beside the couch, gesturing for us to take a seat. His smile remained pleasant, but there was something in his eyes that was just one shade too keen. It was as if he was studying us, cataloging every detail. "I get few visitors out here by the cemetery," he said with a small chuckle. "It's always nice to have company." The silence was broken by Jack. "Thanks for letting us in. This place. It's different," he said, his voice really giving away that this whole thing made him uneasy. We nodded, all of us glancing around, taking in the unusual surroundings. The man noticed our interest and gave a knowing smile. "Yes, it has a charm of its own, doesn't it? It's been in my family for ages." His eyes moved to the pumpkins that sat on the shelves. "Each of those has a story, you know. One for every Halloween." Emma shifted uncomfortably, looked at me with a "let's get outta here" expression, but before any one of us could utter a word, this man headed to the door and, with a suggestion of false casualness, clicked the lock shut. It was a sharp noise, and my heart suddenly went racing. My friends fell silent. I could feel tension build up in each one of them. "Just to keep the draft out," he explained, at the look of our faces. Again, his smile didn't reach his eyes, and something in his gaze, something dark and intent, though his tone stayed light, seemed to flicker. Liz tried to lighten the mood. "So, what's the story behind those pumpkins?" she asked, gesturing toward one that seemed to be carved in a particularly malignant grin. The old man's eyes sparkled, as if he'd expected this question. That one." He stumbled over to it, running his fingers along its surface as if something precious touched them. "That one was a rather spirited visitor. She tried to leave before she'd even finished her treat." A chill went down my spine when he said it, the casualness of his tone layered with something that didn't sit right. I looked at my friends, and judging by the look of realization across their faces, we needed to get out. But before anyone could move, he was back to us, his eyes intense. "You know, Halloween is a special night," he said slowly, savoring every word. "A night for treats and surprises." It felt suffocating in the room, and I found myself edging toward the door, trying to hide the anxiety. But there was nowhere to go. We were in his domain now, and a sinking feeling had begun to stir inside me that he wasn't going to let us go quite that easily. A heavy silence fell over the room as we digested what the man had said. He seemed so normal, just another adult with his weird Halloween decorations and love of creepy stories. But now as he stared at us, his eye glinting ominously in the dim light, the atmosphere went cold. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I sensed my friends fidgeting nervously beside me. Just as I was going to say we needed to get out of there, he slowly raised his hand and laid it over his face. In one smooth, calculated action, he peeled off the mask he'd been wearing, a thin, realistic mask that had concealed his features. Underneath, his skin was sallow, near ghostly, his eyes dark and sunken, staring at us with an expression which chilled my blood. It wasn't just a mask, as if we had been looking at something which did not belong on this earth, that had stepped out of a nightmare. "Why the shock?" he asked now, in a different voice, much deeper and with an undertone of strangeness. "Halloween is the night we all wear masks, isn't it? The night we can be anything or anyone we want." I stared at my friends, eyes wide, and scanned around for an exit, but he was still standing between us and the door, the only exit that I could see. The flickering candles inside the pumpkins cast long shadows across the walls behind him, and I swore they looked like figures twisted and distorted as if watching our every move. Years ago, he resumed, with a low, almost hypnotic tone, people in this town started to tell stories. Stories of a man who collected visitors on Halloween. Those who knocked upon the wrong door, you see, became permanent residents. He motioned to the pumpkins, his eyes never leaving us. Each one has a story of its own. Each one used to be like you. A chill went through me as I took a closer look at the carved pumpkins arranged all over the room. There was something unnervingly human in their expressions, each face arrested in some characteristic attitude of fear, surprise, or terror, as if they were life or had been. We should get going now. I think our parents are expecting us back soon, my friend Emma stuttered, forcing a shaking smile to make her appear composed, while fear was as clear as daylight. The man's face contorted into a smirking grin. But you've only just arrived. Halloween night is still young. Stay a while. I promise, it'll be unforgettable. With that, he turned and strode toward the fireplace, lifting something small off of the mantel. A worn twisted piece of wood. It looked like a wand, or a charm. He held it up, his gaze darkening as he focused on us, his grin widening with malevolent delight. Don't you understand, he said, his voice dropping to a low whisper that seemed to carry through the room. You're my guests now. And here, guests stay forever. In an instant, the room was cold, warmth sucked from it, leaving a chill seeming to seep right into my bones. The flickering candlelight dimmed, casting the room in shadow. I could feel the closeness of the walls, the air congealing with a sense of dread that threatened to suffocate me. Panic washed over me, and I knew we needed to get out. Instinctively, I reached for Jack's arm and whispered into his ear, "The window, let's go out the window." The others nodded, and as unobtrusively as possible, we inched away towards the back of the room, to a small, grimy window which allowed in an infinitesimal sliver of moonlight. But no sooner did we take our first step, he whirled around, his smile gone. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. And here I thought we were getting along so well. My heart was racing as he started to walk toward us, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like some kind of predator stalking its prey. I reached the window, tugging at it in desperation, but it wouldn't budge. The frame was swollen with age and neglect. I glanced over my shoulder to see him getting closer and closer, his eyes locked on us with a predatory intensity that made my skin crawl. "Hurry," Liz whispered, her voice barely audible, but the window refused to give in. Then, just when I thought our goose was cooked, Jack took a deep breath, threw his weight against the frame. With one loud crack, the window slid open, cold refreshing night air pouring inside. I scrambled out immediately, without thinking twice, followed by the rest. We burst into the dewy grass, and I heard the man's voice inside the house, "Come out through the broken window." "You can run," he called, a hint of his amusement in his tone. "But you'll never leave." We didn't wait to hear what he meant by that. We ran across the yard, our breathing harsh and rapid, not looking back as the house fell behind us. We did not stop running until we were well away from the house, breathless and our eyes wide. It was sharper outside, colder almost unnaturally so, and an uneasy silence prevailed over the street. Panted, we turned back, expecting to see looming in the doorway a dark silhouette of the man, but the house sat silent and dark, like nothing had happened. Did we imagine all that?" Liz whispered, hugging her arms, her face white. I shook my head, the fear still clutched in my chest. No. That was real. Too real. We began walking back into town, but with every step, we couldn't help but feel that something was amiss. The streets were free of life, not just quiet, but actually abandoned. No lights came from the houses, and no decorations adorned their doors. It was as if Halloween had never come, as if the town itself had long since been abandoned. "Where is everybody?" Jack whispered. Turning around, his voice was all but inaudible, and his face contorted with fear. "This isn't right. This can't be right." Emma yanked my arm, and she was trembling. "Look around, it's like time's stopped. Like everything's frozen. These houses that once seemed to shine with Halloween decorations in their windows now stood dark, lifeless, their windows either broken or smeared with grime. The sidewalks were thickly carpeted with leaves, and vines crept up the walls, twisting around doorways and windows like nature was reclaiming it all. It had become something else, wrong, from the town we knew. Then we saw the light. Ahead of us, lining the road, were jack-o'-lanterns that crowded together, casting an eerie orange glow that stretched the shadows long and quivering. But they were nothing like the benign pumpkins from before. Their faces contorted, their features twisted in terror or fury in individual, authentic ways. It was as though they watched us as we passed, their hollow eyes tracing our every step. Liz clutched my arm, her voice trembling. "Those pumpkins, they look just like the ones in his house." I felt my stomach drop as I looked at them more closely. She was right. They had that same strange, almost human expressions, as if they were somehow alive. And they seemed to be leading us somewhere, like a twisted pathway back to the house we'd fled. "Let's get out of here," I said, and my voice was steady, though fear clawed at me. "We need to find someone, anybody." But the longer we walked, the stranger the town seemed. The street lamps sputtered, casting small pools of light that barely broke through the darkness. Shadows stretched and twisted around us, giving the buildings a dark, looming presence. Every now and then, I thought I saw a figure watching from a window, only to find it gone when I turned my head to look. The silence was maddening, punctuated only by the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. My heart raced, as with every step deeper, we ventured further into the unknown, further into a place that barely resembled the town we knew. With every step, the little things bothered me. Every street and every house had something strange about them, as if the town itself had aged overnight. Cracks snaked across walls, paint peeled off, and windows coated in layers of dust dulled any hint of light. The familiar landmarks looked like they had been left to decay for decades. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The streets were empty, but the shadows seemed to press closer, like they held unseen eyes. Liz suddenly gasped and pointed to one of the houses. "Look, isn't that where Mrs. Landry lives?" We all turned, instantly recognizing the house. Mrs. Landry's house had always been warm and inviting, flower boxes adorning every window and lights twinkling on in her porch. Now, however, it seemed hollowed out. The flower boxes lay empty, just dried, brittle vines cascading over their edges, and the porch light was off, its bulb broken, dangling from its socket. I swallowed as the knot in my stomach twisted tighter. It's like everyone just left and never came back." Emma hadn't said a word since leaving the house, and suddenly, in a voice no louder than a whisper, she said, What if we didn't actually leave? What if we're still in that man's house somehow?" The suggestion hung in the air, sending chills down our spines. It sounded ridiculous, impossible even, but nothing felt real anymore. The town was like some sort of twisted version of itself, a dark mirror image of what it once had been. We continued walking, hoping to stumble upon anything that could make sense of what was happening. As we turned the corner, more of the ghostly jack-o'-lanterns lined the street, faces contorted in terror and pain. Each one fluttered with our passing, giving brief shadows that capered in the cold wind. I found myself averting my gaze, but the sense of being watched intensified, as if the pumpkins themselves were alive and watching us with malice. And then, up ahead, we saw it, the faint glow of a familiar house. The man's house, sitting there as if nothing had happened, the only building that looked untouched by decay. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow that was horribly out of place in this twisted version of our town. No way," Jack stuttered, taking a step back. "How did we end up back here?" It hit me in the solar plexus. As they say, we'd been circling around the house trying to get free from it, and every road came back to that blasted house. The whole of the town was some sort of trap, twisting and turning to keep us right here. "We have to go in," I said, my voice shaking. "If this is the only place that hasn't changed, maybe there's a way out inside." Emma gave me a look like I'd lost my mind. "Go back in there? Are you insane?" We barely made it out the first time. But standing there, the wind through the empty streets and the jack-o'-lantern's glow fading, a terrible conviction overcame me. Whatever was ringing our town, whatever hex that man had laid on us, had something to do with that house. That was the only place answers and just maybe our escape could be found. I took a deep breath, forged ahead, and my friends followed more reluctantly. The air thickened as we came back to the house, our breaths misting in the chill still night. The house seemed larger than I remembered, its shadows deeper, sinister. My mind was a running storm of images, every one of those twisted jack-o'-lanterns, every one of those empty houses, every one of those silences that had felt like weights crushing us with every step. My hand hesitated at the door, but something pressed me on. Behind, my friends murmured in whispers of fear, each of them torn by some doubtful desire to stand outside in the chilling unknown or press back again into the place that had all but imprisoned us. "Come on," I whispered, doing the best I could to put some bravery into my voice. I had absolutely no idea what we'd find, but something in my head kept insisting we couldn't move on from the nightmare until we did know why it had changed. The instant we were in, it clicked softly behind us, the door shut behind us, a soft click that sounded to my mind like the confirmation of a verdict of death. The warmth was gone, and in came damp chill, coldness that seemed to seep right inside my bones. Darker now, the room revealed how candlelight contorted on the walls, distorting the faces of the pumpkins themselves, it seemed, watching with knowing, malicious grins. I led the way, edging slowly through the house. Each creak of the floorboard sent shivers running down my spine. My friends followed close behind me, their footsteps were indistinguishable, buried in that now growing hum of filled silence. The sound was faint initially, just some vague whispery stuff that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But as we moved deeper into the house, it got louder, more distinct. It was low, rhythmic chanting, like some ancient lullaby sung in a language none of us recognized. "Do you hear that?" Liz whispered, her grip on my arm tight. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, working around the lump in my throat. The sound was coming from the direction of the parlor, where we'd seen the man with the twisted mask. The shadows in that room were denser, pooling in corners and spreading out in dark rivulets across the floor, like some kind of living thing. I could feel them pressing in on us, making the room feel smaller, more oppressive. And then, in the corner of the patch, I saw him. The man stood motionless, his back to us, his head cocked as if listening to something only he could hear. His hands rested on one of the pumpkins, a big one, its face frozen in a look of pure terror. It glowed faintly, casting an eerie orange light, which fluttered like a pulse in time with the chanting. "Why'd you come back?" he said in a voice low and quick, almost amused, that cut through the hum like a blade. I stepped backward, but I knew it was too late. There was nothing to do, nowhere to go. We were in his domain now, and he certainly acted like it. Slowly, he turned, and I could more fully perceive his face now, the mask gone, pale and hollow, twisted into aspects as if it couldn't hold one shape. The eyes were darker, empty, almost inhuman. "You wanted to leave," he continued, his voice soft, almost hypnotic. "But you came back. Isn't that what you wanted?" I had nothing to say. Neither did my friends. Fear had repressed the vocal cords of every one of us. We had been kidnapped, lost in some twisted version of our very own town, and this man, whatever he was in the possession of every single clue we needed. But at what price? He moved closer, his footsteps silent, gliding across the floor as if he himself were part of the shadows. Every year on Halloween night, people come to my door, searching for something they don't understand. And every year they leave behind something of themselves. It's the price of curiosity. I looked around at all the pumpkins scattered about, each face just a bit too real, too lifelike. And in that instant, it clicked: these weren't just decorations. They were people, souls, really, condemned to eternal torment because of curiosity that had brought them to the place and then bound them here for all eternity. My heart racing, I turned back to him, doing my best to keep my voice from shaking. We don't belong here. Let us go. Please." He smiled a cold, mirthless grin that ran a shiver down my spine. "But you do belong here. You knocked on my door. You crossed the threshold. You are mine now." With no warning, he lunged forward, his hand reaching out, and in a panic, I shoved Jack toward the nearest door. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Liz and Emma as we scrambled down the narrow hallway. The chanting grew louder, the walls seeming to close in, pressing us from all sides. We ran from room to room, all were distorting, more decaying each second. Roots twisted, black, and grasping out for us covered the walls. I tried to keep my focus, but faces in the walls, shadows with eyes, twisted shapes that watched us starving, attacked my eyes wherever I turned. Finally, we came to a set of stairs at the back of the house, and not thinking much about it, ran up them, the footsteps of the man behind us echoing. The higher we climbed, the chill of the air colder with each upward step as my heart raced. At the top, I pushed open a door and we tumbled into a room of mirrors. Those mirrors reflected us, but somehow the reflection was wrong. Each showed a version of ourselves, twisted in some fashion like the pumpkins out in the yard, their faces carved for trick or treat, eyes hollow, mouths open as if in silent scream. It was nauseating, and I turned away, bile rising up the inside of my throat. Jack tugged on my arm, his skin gray. "We have to find a way out. Now." We turned and ran down the stairs, the chanting filled our ears when we reached the front door. I grabbed the handle, yanking it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. Behind us, the man's voice grew louder, closer, his footsteps echoing through the house. "This place will be your home," he called, his voice carrying a note of finality. I threw my shoulder against it in one last desperate heave. It burst open and the cold night air struck me like a slap. We spilled out onto the porch, gasping, and kept on running without the courage to look backward. The chanting grew dim, the house vanished among the shadows as we fled back toward the town. By the time we reached the familiar streets, we realized the horror wasn't over yet. The streets were still empty, still decaying, and the jack-o'-lantern still lined the path, glowing with an evil light that caused my stomach to do flips. The street opened up before us, dark and deserted, as if we had been transported into a ghost town. Every building was turned off, every storefront broken or boarded up, broken signs groaned in the cold wind, slung precariously. The houses were hollow, decaying, with sagging roofs and shattered panes. We might as well have crossed into another dimension of sorts, one in which time had given up on everything that was familiar. We walked in tense silence, our footsteps the only sound. My mind was juggling 1,000 questions, but fear held them at bay. I kept turning around, half expecting to see the man's twisted face or his house looming out of the darkness behind us. But there was nothing, just an empty road running into shadow. Liz spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. It's like this place hasn't been lived in for decades." I nodded, swallowing hard. The macabre silence, the decrepit houses, the trees withered, they felt so unreal, a place haunted by its own past. "This has to be some kind of trick," I said, more to myself than for anybody else. "We're still in his house. Somehow. This can't be real." Jack shook his head, his face pale in the flickering light of a nearby pumpkin. "But it feels real. Too real." We continued walking, sticking close together, our eyes darting around as shadows twisted and flickered across the street. The jack-o'-lanterns still lined the path, their hollow eyes and twisted grins lighting up the dark. Their expressions seemed almost mocking, like they knew something we didn't. Then, we heard a faint sound, barely audible but unmistakable, footsteps echoing down the empty street, growing closer. We froze, exchanging terrified glances. The steps grew louder, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Run," I whispered, barely able to breathe. We didn't wait but ran, racing down the street, until I could hear footsteps getting faster, closing the gap. It was as if the shadows themselves were closing in, reaching out to drag us back to that house. We ran down alleys, leaping over broken fences, skirting piles of debris. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop. I could sense the presence at our heels, relentless, merciless. It was as if the town itself had risen up, twisting, contorting, forcing us backward toward the man's house. At last we reached the town square and dropped onto the cracked pavement, panting. The footfalls stopped and a moment of silence fell over the square. But that only made it worse, for it was one of those silences that seemed to live, like it was waiting for something. I looked up, and there it was, the house, somehow standing in the middle of the square, as if it had been there along. The porch light flickered, casting an eerie glow that stretched out to tendrils, it seemed, pulling us back to its door. "No," Liz whimpered, trembling. We ran the other way. "This can't be happening." Emma's nails dug into my arm as she clutched it. "We're trapped, aren't we?" A chill washed over me as the realization set in. We'd tried to get away, but every path, every street had turned us right back to this very spot. The house was inescapable, an unbreakable curse binding us to its walls. I took a trembling breath, scrabbling at what little courage was left to me. If we can't get away, then maybe we need to confront him. Maybe he's the only way out. Jack looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I saw that same fear, same desperation, in his eyes. There was no choice left. The house had us in its grasp, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight with whatever horror lay inside. We flung one last terrified glance at each other and turned, stepping back toward the house as the door creaked open, almost as if waiting for us all this time. We stood there, staring at the house in the middle of the town square, a place that could not exist, yet somehow had swallowed us whole. It was as if even the shadows were alive, leaning in, watching, urging us to step back inside. I could see real terror in my friends' faces, mirroring my own, but there was something else too, an understanding. If we didn't face whatever was inside that house, we might be trapped here forever. I took a deep breath and nudged the front door open. It creaked low and swung into the same dimly lit room as before, where candles inside the pumpkins flickered weakly, casting an eerie shadow on the walls. The air was thick and heavy, like the atmosphere was taut, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath while waiting for us to make our move. We stepped inside one by one, and we were all shaking, yet determined. The moment we had crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind us and locked with a force that seemed to resound throughout the house. I could feel the wave of panic rise to my chest, but I swallowed it down, focusing on the task ahead. Before us was a hall, whose walls were lined with those unreal and twisted jack-o'-lanterns, their faces stuck in expressions of horror or mockery. The lanterns seemed to watch us, their hollow eyes glinted with an unnatural light. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that they were more than just decorations, that they held pieces of souls of those before us who hadn't made it out. We moved further inward, our footsteps the only ones resounding in the quiet. The chanting we had heard had stopped, and in its place seemed to be a low humming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was almost as though the house itself was alive, pulsing with dark energy through every corner of it. As we came into the parlor, the man was standing in front of the fireplace, his back towards us, his hands clasped behind him. He appeared even more formidable now, as if he had waxed bigger, stronger since the last time I saw him. He spoke without turning, his voice low, mocking. You tried to leave, didn't you? You thought you could escape me, but there is no leaving once you've crossed my threshold. This place. It exists outside of time, outside reality. Here, you are mine. I swallowed hard, making myself take that step forward. Why are you doing this? What do you want from us? He chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. Isn't it obvious? Halloween is a night for collection of souls. You knocked on my door, and you must pay the price. Liz clutched my arm, her voice was low in a fearful whisper. We gotta get out of here. He's not human. The man turned then, face contorted, shifting between human and something else, a twisted visage ghastly in that candlelight. His eyes were dark voids, hollow and endless, and his smile too wide, full of inhuman malice. You want to leave? He sneered. Very well. But you'll have to pass one last test. The floorboards beneath us began to creak, and all of a sudden, the room started to shift. It seemed as though the walls were stretching and twisting, pulling us in different directions. I felt the ground shifting under my feet. When I looked around, we were no longer in the parlor. We were in a maze of rooms, each one identical, each one filled with more of those ghastly jack-o'-lanterns, their faces twisted in agony. I could hear my friends calling out, their voices echoing through the maze, but every time I turned a corner, I found myself back where I'd started, surrounded by the flickering, mocking faces of the pumpkins. Panic scratched at my skin as I struggled to keep my breath in order. Stay together. I yelled, praying someone heard me. We can't let him separate us. But this house was set on severing every bond. Walls budged in and out, doors appeared and disappeared, and I could hear footsteps, his footsteps growing closer with every passing second, a deafening drumbeat that never faltered or moved away. Just about the time I thought I was really trapped, I could see a light up ahead, a glimmer of hope in darkness. I raced toward it, hoping it would take me out. I tumbled into the light, back out into the front hallway, and Liz, Emma, and Jack standing beside me, their faces pale and exhausted. He'd stood at the far end of the hall, his face cold and calculating. Congratulations, he said with an ice-chilling sarcasm. You made it back. But let me remind you again, nobody leaves without leaving something of themselves behind. Before I could act, he raised his hand, and there was a blinding flash of light in the room. I felt a shooting pain in my chest, as if something was being torn out of it, and everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was laying in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. Morning light streamed through my window, warm and bright. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, a horrible, twisted dream brought on by too much Halloween candy and too many scary stories. But as I turned to survey my room, my gaze fell on something which sat by the window, a lone jack-o'-lantern, its face contorted into some sort of malignant leer. It glowed dimly in the daylight, a husk of light running shivers down my spine. I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to vanish, but it was solid, real. The memory of the house, the man, the endless maze, all of it came rushing back, and with a sinking feeling I realized it hadn't been a dream. Somehow, a piece of that night had followed me back. And as I sat, staring at the jack-o'-lantern, softly carried on the wind, I heard a whispered "Happy Halloween, see you next year."